Hello, this is a tutorial to make a motor test board for Falcon 500 using a TNC Arduino. For this project, you'll need a couple of things, the first being a breadboard as well as a TNC. You'll also need a potentiometer. Make sure that this is position-based and not speed-based, so that is the resistance changes depending on where in the rotation this pin is rather than how fast the pin is spinning. You'll also need some jumper cables, a cable to connect your TNC to your computer, some jumper cables, a falcon, a PDH, a battery, and then a computer, of course. We're going to start with making the board itself. There are two main parts. There's the input from the potentiometer and then the output that goes to the motor. So we'll start with the input to the potentiometer. The first step to doing this is looking up the data sheet for the potentiometer as well as the TNC Arduino. I have those two pulled up. So for the potentiometer, we see that the first terminal is ground, the third terminal is power, and the middle terminal is the signal coming out. Now for the TNC datasheet, we're using an older TNC which is shorter and looks like this. The power and ground will be these first two pins, and then we'll take the signal into the TNC through an analog pin, which is demarked by these A0 through 9 pins right here, and we'll just choose A0 just because. For power and ground, we can take a jumper cable and plug the respective pins into the power and ground rails on the breadboard, like so. If I can get it in the pin. And no, we're not following standard color conventions. And then for the potentiometer, we can plug it into the ground as well as power rails. And lastly, we can plug in the signal into the analog pin, which is 2 up. So 1, 2. Now let's go look at the Falcon manual so we know how to input the signal correctly. For this project, we're going to use PWM instead of CAN for signaling. This is just because PWM is a little bit easier to work with and we don't need to convert to the CAN communication system. So for that, we're just going to have to look up how to use PWM with a Falcon. So we can just search that up. In this table here, we see that PWM signal goes into the yellow wire on the Falcon, and then PWM ground goes into the green wire. This does mean that we will need a ground and signal wire coming off of the TNC, and so for that we need to look back at the TNC data sheet. For ground, that's simple. We can just plug it into the ground power rail that we set up earlier. And then for signal, let's just choose another analog pin because the signal is analog. So we'll just choose A9 just for the heck of it. We can start by just plugging in one wire into the ground rail for the PWM ground. And then we can also plug another one into pin A9, which is the fourth one down. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Plug it in here for the signal that's going out to the Falcon. Then lastly, we can just put alligator clips on the ends of these jumper cables so that it's easier to attach to the Falcon's wires. From here, we'll move on to coding the motor test board. To code the motor test board, you're going to need to install two pieces of software. You'll need the Arduino app so you can code the Arduino, and then you'll need the TNC Arduino software so you can convert from this Arduino to the TNC itself, which is a different but similar microcontroller. The links to both of the software will be in the description. So now let's just go over the code. We're going to set a value to, or I guess a variable to 0 at the very beginning. And then in setup, we're going to open the, or I guess initialize the serial monitor. From there, we will set 2 pins. So if you'll remember, we set A0 as our input pin, so we're just going to set that here in the code, and then we set A9 as our output or signal pin, so we're also just going to write that here in the code. And then in the loop, so what we're going to be running over and over, we're going to read from that input pin, and we're going to read with analog, and then we're going to set our variable to that reading. From there, we'll map the input signal in. So the signal in goes from 0 to 1023, and we want that to be outputted in values from 0 to 255. So if you think about it, you can think about it as taking the signal from the potentiometer and translating it for signal for the falcon. So that's what this map function does here. And then lastly, we're going to send that mapped number, or that mapped value, to a 9 to send to the motor itself. And then we'll delay a little bit because we don't need it to be running, every single second or every single moment. All right, finally we can put all the pieces together. You'll have your battery, which is attached to a PDH or PDP. We're using a PDP today. And then that PDP is wired to the Falcon. So this is how we get power to the Falcon. From there, we plug the motor test board into the computer. So we just got to put 2 and 2 together. Let's take the signal wires from the Falcon, and we can clip them to the output signal from the Teensy. So if you'll remember, this yellow alligator clip is attached to pin A9, which is where the signal will come out of. And yellow is for the PWM signal in our case, and then the green is attached to ground for PWM ground. Okay, so before we even flip the switch to power the Teensy, we'll start by uploading the code to the Teensy. So to do that, it's very simple. You just open Teensy Arduino, open your code, and you go Tools, and you go down to Port, and make sure that the port is selected. So this is the port that's plugged in here. That's why we have it selected. Next, we can then press the upload button, and it should wait a little bit, it should run something down here. All right, it's been uploaded. So now, you should be able to turn the power on. When you turn the power on, you want to hold the motor really tight. So that clip just hit it there. And then by turning the potentiometer, which is here, it'll be off camera, it should cause the motor to turn.